Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for agreeing to this. We really appreciate it. If you could just state your name, the year you were born, and the town you were
Sound like a
born.
hospital. Benny Dean, born 1/15/38, and I was real little.
And what was the town that you grew up in?
Pardon?
The town you grew up in?
Basically Eudora, but
Okay.
I was born in Arkansas, and the war situation brought my parents up here to Sunflower,
Okay.
and been here ever since.
Did both of your parents work for the plant?
No,
No.
my dad did for a short time. Before he went in on his shift, they had an explosion. A few months later, as he had come off his shift, they had an explosion. And he said that was close enough, so he quit.
Oh, wow. Do you remember what year that was?
Had to be back in the late 40s. I don't
40s.
remember. Like I said, it was probably kindergarten, first grade, something like that.
And did you live in town? Did you live at Sunflower Village?
No, we lived several places around Eudora,
Okay.
and we was more or less oriented in Eudora area.
Could you describe growing up in Eudora?
It's a typical small town in a sense, even though it got heavily populated from about 40s on, up in the late 50s. Typical small town ways. I think we had one policeman, and everybody took care of their own trash, stuff like that. Had his city superintendent that run the water plant, and city had a trash dump, so everybody had to haul their trash out of town. Not all the streets were paved. They were there, but most of them was gravel. The Church Street up here, we call it, and Main Street was two of the paved streets, and the rest in between were gravel. I do remember mowing the roadsides with a horse-drawn sickle bar and things like that. It was up and growing. They tell me, I was, like I say, small, during the late 40s, early 50s, anywhere there was a vacant lot, somebody put a small camper, house, trailer, or something like that to work at Sunflower. Housing was a priority. I remember the first residence that we lived in was very small, but had 2 bedrooms and a kitchen, and that was probably great at the time.
Yeah. Do you remember the reaction, or maybe hearing stories about the reaction of the increase in population? What was the sentiment of the town?
Well, it was glad to have the people come for money-wise, but it wasn't overly thrilled with the population, because they come from every section of the country to work at the Sunflower Ordnance Works.
This is how to phrase my question. Do you kind of remember how things shifted when huge population came in? Do you have a distinct
Well,
memory?
yeah, like I say, they started, getting small improvements. Like there was 2 grocery stores done very well, but there was one time I think there were 11 service stations in town.
Wow.
That the pictures are over here on the wall. You can observe them there if you wish.
So we hear that you know a lot about Prairie Center, the little town that got
boy.
demolished.
Yes, I will have to put this, my wife was born in Prairie Center. So my in-laws were from Prairie Center. And what they told me and had written, that the government come in, says, here's you some money, see ya. My mother-in-law had to have a little round badge to get back in to pick up what was left of their place. They run a gas station and a small little variety. My hay fever setting in on me. Father-in-law said when he was small, and we still have the little bitty seat that they put on the wagon for him to sit on the front seat of the wagon. They would go to Olathe and buy their supplies for the week on like Saturday. He said it would take them all day to go by wagon to Olathe back to Prairie Center. Prairie Center was a halfway thriving little community like a lot of the others. It had a telephone office, a creamery, a couple of churches, a school, and the government purchased it all and come in with a bulldozer. And the in-laws, their name was Edwin and Sybil Rice, had the service station that sat catty-cornered to a corner. You know, you kids don't remember that type of stations, but you could drive through this little canopy. From that, they had a fish pond, concrete with rocks on top. It's still there. When they got to visit in about 85, I was privileged to drive them down there to the area, and that's one thing they found, and they did feel good about that.
Yeah.
But my wife's aunt was a telephone operator there. She went on later to work for Bell Telephone for 40-something years. They had, like I say, a creamery and churches. The one church, I think, Friends, moved toward Edgerton, which was on the south edge of the plant. But I think they ended up over in Gardner as an established place.
Do you remember what year specifically you moved up to Eudora from Arkansas? Was it 42 when they first opened?
Oh no, it's
later?
closer to 44 or 45.
Okay.
But the little house that I know we lived in, you girls, what I refer to Wilson's truck farm, he had a, what do you call them, tanker trucks, fertilizer trucks, large semis, a mile out of town, or half mile out of town, and about a half mile over. That was where we first stayed. And then there was a small apartment on Church Street and 9th Street, which the complex has been bulldozed down. It was an upstairs apartment above a garage. Wasn't very big, but it was available.
Mm-hmm.
What did your dad do down in Arkansas before he came up here?
He was a farmer. His reason for coming was the government had sent him a draft notice.
Oh.
So he sold everything on the farm, put it all into savings bonds so Mom would be able to, handle it. And about the day before he was to go for the induction, they called him and said the war's over.
Wow.
So there was I was told a bus come through with a loudspeaker saying, we'll take you to Sunflower Ordnance Works. They need employees. So he went. Then several months later, he came to home there in Arkansas and loaded up all the families and we come back.
Mm-hmm.
But his first thing was to come for employment there.
So was it just you and your parents, or did
No,
any of your
there's,
siblings?
well, there's 3 siblings at that time.
Okay.
I had an older brother, myself, and a younger sister. Since then, they've been 3 more added.
So when you moved, there was
Just
5 of you?
5 of us, yeah.
Okay.
Your dad didn't want to go back down to Arkansas after he
He
came
did.
up here?
I think he got, well, I'd say established in the area.
Yeah.
And since he sold out everything in Arkansas, there wasn't anything left but the families. And he couldn't see going back and starting all over again. So he just, he found other employment, and one thing led to another, and we've been here ever since. Why, I don't know, but we were.
When your father left the plant, what did he do after?
I think he went to carpenter work, and that's what he retired in, as a contract carpenter, locally mainly.
What year did you start working at the plant?
Had to be in the late 70s to mid 70s, about mid 70s.
What'd you do out there?
My first jobs were on the fire department. I was on the fire department here, and knowing everybody in town, they said there's an opening in the fire department. So I went and applied, and with some background in firefighting, they hired me. And Sunflower, you gotta understand their mode of operation. If they got a contract for so many 1,000 pounds of powder, they run that system. When it was done, then they'd have to lay everybody off, or mainly everybody off. Keep the old timers, we called it. And then they would get a contract, say, to rebuild a building. Well, then they'd bring in a contract supervisor to do that. And once that come through, maybe that only lasted 3 or 4 years, they would get another contract to put so much powder. So they hired several hundred people back. And I was able to come back. And so did a lot of other people. And that was I guess the government way of doing things.
Yeah.
Did you come back as a fire?
No, I went back as a boiler operator in a power plant. They had 3 power plants out there. They were a city within themselves. Anything that a city would have, they had it or better. They had some very huge operating facilities.
How would you describe the company, the Hercules company? Do you feel like they were?
Well, Sunflower plant was run by Hercules Power Company, which was a subcontractor for the government. So I think the first operations, the government was like, the expense plus so much money. That's how they operated. The last operations, I think they had to more or less tighten the build up a little bit, and it wasn't a cost plus job. And in the 60s, they built nitroguanidine, which was a inert to gunpowder for cannons mainly. I worked as a maintenance there. When I went back from being a boiler operator, got laid off again after 2 or 3 years, and they was in the process of building this nitroguanidine plant, which was about the only one in the free world that brought in the product raw, and as it went out the back buildings, it was a finished product. And it was very highly explosive. And they would put it mainly in cannon powder for the ships and or for tanks and artillery. but they also had some subcontracts in there for some what they call Zuni powder, which I think was made for the Navy or something of that nature. I was not in the production areas to know.
Did you feel safe working at the plant?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was
The safety out there was just unbelievable. I mean, you signed in areas, you signed out of areas. You wore your safety equipment or else you got in trouble. And it was a well-organized group. But, because they had their own police department, or we call it security, their own fire department, their own water department, their own garages. I don't know if you've ever been past the road, new road that goes around through DeSoto.
No.
Well, that was to go through the north edge of the plant. And for security reasons, they had to move it to the north toward DeSoto. But there's they call that river intake, which they had huge wells in the river area. They got a river intake plant down there that pumped water up to that plant, and it's treated in and then pumped on over to the operating area.
I'm curious what the culture was like at the plant, because there was so many people going and coming back.
Oh, there was all kinds of jokes about the Okies and the Arkies running it and all this, but they were just employees, and it was a well-organized group. I mean, you had a certain building you worked in, and that's where you were. You didn't get out and go pick flowers. That was where you were designed to work and how you were trained to work. And they had like O line, D line, F line. Each one was a portion of what was the operation. And so they got along in those areas.
When the plant closed officially, what was your reaction to that?
Oh, I think a lot of people knew it was coming. They didn't know it was that quick because I guess the Cold War stopped, basically. They didn't need the powder at the extreme portions they thought they needed. But the Sunflower Army Ammunition Plant was not the only one that made that type of powder. I think there's 5 other organizations, Bradford and Virginia, then there was a couple out west that they were mainly in the central part of the United States. If we were ever attacked then, you know, it'd be forever for them to get to us. But like I said, they more or less, their first operations were more like the Army rules and regulations. And then as that stopped, they went, they were still very strict on everything, but it wasn't as the Army rules and regulations would demand.
You were still working out there when it closed, right?
Yes. Well, I was putting time in. Try not to work anymore than I had to.
Yeah.
But no, the maintenance crew was still there, and there was a skeleton crew after most everybody left, more or less to shut the area down. In other words, everything had to be cleaned up and padlocked and all this stuff. Then they went in and sold most everything. What they didn't sell, they bulldozed flat. And I think the only big building still standing is this Guanardine area on this side of the plant, on the west side. The main entrance, I understood they saved those buildings for the contractors that they would hope to have in the future. And then they had what we called maintenance areas, garages. They kept them open for their stuff that they had at that time. I don't know how they're operating now, but those were the last buildings that were still in operation.
When you first started working there in the 70s, was it still one of the better paying jobs in the area, like it was in the 40s?
Oh, yeah, yes, I'm sure. I got it from where I was working at that time. Going back to Sunflower, I probably increased $2 an hour in pay. And most people that was there, you know, under the same thing, it's one of the higher places to get employment. But in the probably the late 80s and everything, it's not hiring as many, so, you know, everybody was sort of anxious to get a job there.
So if you had one, you wanted to hold on to it.
You did. There was what we call the old timers that never did get laid off. They were there long enough to hold seniority, and I think full retirement was 32 years, and there was several that I know of that got full retirement, that they had the seniority when the time between contracts, they were still able to stay there and hold a job, doing whatever it was that was required of them.
Did Jean ever work out at the plant?
Pardon?
Did your wife ever work out at the
Oh,
plant?
no. There were several husband and wives that did work there, though, but that was just a coincidence, I think. They didn't go out and try to find families. I do know of aunts and uncles of other families that worked out there. I mean, they didn't discriminate. They more or less run a city because they had their own railroads, they had their own engineers, their own water treatments, their own security company, had their own contract garage people that worked on heavy equipment, automobiles. It was a city within itself.
Probably one of the only people that was there at the beginning, there at the end, other than these seniority people you talked about.
Yeah. I got 23 years in,
Yeah.
and it was good income. They put my daughters through college and bought my house and bought my cars, and not that there wasn't other paying jobs around that was good, but because when I got out of high school, I started to work in a grocery store here in town and was working my way up to assistant plant operator. And I thought I'd done real well. The owner of the business got married, went on a week's honeymoon, and left me in charge. I thought that was halfway decent of him for me to be honored or have that much confidence in me.
Yeah.
And the bank was still up on the corner too.
Were the workers out there unionized?
Yes, there were. The only ones that was not was the fire department and the security department. But before I left, the fire department was unionized. There were a lot of disgruntled employees. Some wanted it, some didn't. But the guards always stayed as just employed as security people.
There was government officials out there, right? Were they in charge of it, or were Hercules people in charge?
When I first started, they were run by the government. They, I guess you'd call them colonels or captains. They had their own house there in the area. As they moved their control office back to Leavenworth, those buildings were sold off. On the west side of the plant was a whole row of what we called staff buildings. Sergeants and their families stayed in a government housing, and but that was all phased out, I think, for expenses, and those houses, a lot of those are in Eudora. When they started selling them out, they bought them very cheap and moved them into town.
Was your father-in-law resentful that he lost his business and lost his home?
Pardon?
Was your father-in-law resentful that he lost his business and lost his home?
Well, I wouldn't say resentful, but I think it sort of caught them by surprise to a point that they would buy out the whole town. But that wasn't the only little town in Johnson County probably that got affected by it. But like I said, that's my little phone, it's a little ring. I don't have to answer telemarketers. And that didn't answer Ben either early this morning.
They call all the time.
Makes good music to a point.
Yeah, start dancing.
Yeah. So the plant right now, what do you think, or what do you feel the community wants to do with it? Because right now, it's just
Well,
sitting there.
It's been in limbo so long, I
Mhm.
think the community really doesn't care to a point. Sure, there's some, maybe the banks or something like that may have some input there, but it's sort of limbo to what can or can't be done there.
Do you have any particular feelings on what should be done with
Pardon?
it? Do you have any particular feelings on what should be done with it, if it should just be left
Oh,
alone?
no, I will not be involved in any of that. I do know there's organizations that want portions of it. You know, like the Johnson County Park Regulator people want a portion of it. I think Manhattan wants part of it, KU wants part of it, and some on down the way. And then, of course, real estate people want to get a big chunk of it.
Yeah. Will you list, because you said you were part of the fire department, boiler operator, and then you worked on maintenance. Was there any other jobs?
No, that's the only ones I had.
Those three?
Yeah.
Okay.
And those were, as I come back from being furloughed, I was able to get a different position and come back.
Did you ever go out to the sunflower village that they built?
Pardon?
Did you ever, you said you didn't live there, but did you ever go out to the sunflower village?
Oh, yes, I had aunts and uncles that lived
Okay.
there.
Can you describe it for us, what it was like out there?
It was just a bunch of houses put together at quickly, and good roads and everything to get in and out. You lived on a street by a letter. In other words, you might live on K Street and somebody else may live on O Street. And at first it was governed by the government, I think. Then in the later operations, it sold to private individuals and corporation. And the houses that could be moved were moved to the areas, you know, DeSoto and Eudora and places would buy those houses very reasonably. But the ones that's still standing are concrete block, so you know they're going to stay there for a while. And those are also owned by a corporation.
You said you had family there. Were they there when it opened, or did they
Oh, no,
move later?
They all come up in the 40s.
Yeah.
And late 40s, mid 40s, they wasn't there when it opened.
Okay.
But when I was in the fire department, I taught two of the guys that was there in the fire department become the old timers because they were there when the plant was built. One said he was a carpenter foreman's helper. And so they had every group had its own group organization. I mean, they were at one time, I thought there was like 3 or 4 service stations, 2 or 3 or 4 lumber yards, because they were building. I mean, they couldn't wait for some guy come 10 mile away to bring them something. They had it there because they had their own railroad. Everything come in legally by rail at that time. So, it was no roads. When they built the barns and houses out there, they built them first and then made the roads to them. And that was the way contractors worked.
In Sunflower Village, it was kind of a social hub because they had a movie theater, and just.
Yes, there was a small city, really. It had a bowling alley, grocery store, its own laundry, it even had a post office. They had about every little thing that you.
Did you ever go there to hang out, socialize, apart from your
No.
family? No.
No, it was Eudora, DeSoto, and Sunflower Village were sort of like young kids with a new toy, You didn't socialize too much with it, but they had their ups and downs like anything else.
I am curious, going to school with the population increase, how was that like?
Well, it probably put a strain on that area. I was, like say in school, I didn't know what was happening here or there. I do know the government subsidized to the school system, I think $5 per kid if your parents were employed at Sunflower. So, and there was a few, to me, funny incidents on that situation, but the government did help out the community. It just didn't isolate you. And it worked out all right.
Do you have any other stories from working at the plant?
Oh, you don't want to hear them. No, you don't want to hear any of them stories. They were fun, you thought at the time, but they're probably not something substantial. But I do know having in-laws at Prairie Center, and then of course he has written a book that you should get and read if you haven't already. And those type of things are sort of the precursor to the plant coming in. And but like I say, it's approximately 10,000 acres of at that time, well-run facilities. And, probably better than most small towns at that time. Because Eudora, DeSoto were never that big to come in and start a whole city. Yeah.
Nope.
You got one?
I think we're good.
Pardon?
I think we're all out of questions.
Okay.
You answered all of them.
If it did.
Yeah.
Thanks, Benny.
I know, thank you so
Yes,
much.
There was a whole lot of more stuff that shouldn't